I transferred all my property, worth $20 million, to a charitable foundation before I fell into a coma, but I never imagined that the coma would not be the worst of it. I could feel my body slowing down long before anyone else seemed to notice. It was in the way my knees ached on the stairs, how the air felt heavier in my chest each morning, and how some days the world looked just a little dimmer, like the light had to fight its way through the window. I'd lived in this house for 47 years, raised 3 children here, buried a husband, planted every rosebush out front myself. It was the place that held my life like an old quilt, every square sewn from some memory. I used to picture my children growing older alongside me, still coming by with their own little ones, still laughing in my kitchen, still asking for my chicken and dumplings on Sundays. But as the years passed, those visits grew fewer. They came for birthdays if they could, Christmas when schedules allowed. And when they did, the conversation never stayed on how I was doing for long. It turned toward my savings, the house, planning for the future. My future, they meant. They were polite enough, in that way people can be polite and still make you feel small. Mom, you should think about downsizing. You don't need all this space, Malcolm would say, eyes flicking toward the china cabinet like he was already measuring it for his dining room. Heather would tell me I ought to update my will, her voice light but her gaze steady. Rachel mostly stayed quiet, but I could see the way she counted the things in the room when she thought I wasn't looking. I told myself I was imagining it, that they were just concerned, thinking ahead. But there was a sharpness beneath their words, a kind of watchfulness. It made me tired in a way that didn't go away with sleep. The truth was I hadn't been feeling strong for months. My breath came shorter with each trip to the mailbox. Some days my heart beat hard enough to make me sit down, even if I'd just been dusting the mantel. I didn't tell them. What good would it do? It would only hurry along the talk about arrangements and next steps. That morning was unremarkable, at least at first. I woke early as always before the sun was all the way up. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes with years of living alone. I made my coffee in the small pot, no sense making more than 1 cup, and carried it to the table by the window. The garden out back needed tending. The roses were heavy with blooms, their heads bowing like they carried too much beauty for their own stems. I felt the same. I just set the cup down when a wave of weakness rolled through me, sudden and deep, like the floor had dropped an inch beneath my feet. My vision blurred at the edges. I reached for the table, my fingers finding the wood, but the strength in my arm failed. The next thing I knew, I was on the kitchen floor, the cold linoleum under my cheek. I don't know how long I stayed there, listening to the clock tick. Then the sound of my own breath, ragged, uneven, filled my ears. I tried to move, to sit up, but my body wouldn't obey. Somewhere in the fog I thought of calling for help, but the phone might as well have been a mile away. When I opened my eyes again, I was in a place that smelled of antiseptic and humming machines. A light too bright to be daylight pressed against my eyelids. My throat burned. Something was taped to my nose. Tubes ran into my arms. A faint beeping kept time with my heart. I turned my head, or thought I did, and saw a figure moving near the foot of the bed. A nurse, maybe. Then another voice, familiar, but I couldn't place it at first. My eyelids felt like lead, but I forced them open just enough to see Heather standing beside Malcolm, their faces oddly calm. Too calm. Rachel was there too, her hands folded in front of her like she was waiting in line for something. They didn't notice I was watching. She woke up for a moment, Malcolm said quietly. Then out again. Heather nodded. Well, we'll see how it goes. But we should talk to the lawyer tomorrow. My breath caught but no sound came out. They were here. But not for me. Not for my hand to hold or my forehead to smooth. They were already thinking ahead, already speaking about what came next for them. I tried to form the words, but my mouth wouldn't work. I slipped again into that heavy dark, their voices fading into the hum of machines. That was the last clear thing I remember before the coma took me fully. The brightness of the hospital lights, the sound of my children's voices, and the cold certainty in my chest that I had just become, in their minds, not a mother but an estate. The world was black and weightless, but sound still reached me in bits and pieces, like voices carried over water. Sometimes it was the nurse with her gentle tone, asking me questions I couldn't answer. Sometimes the clatter of a tray being rolled into the room. But more and more it was them, my children, talking just a few feet away from where I lay, as though I were already gone. I remember the first time I caught the thread of their conversation. It was Malcolm's voice, low but urgent. "We need to make decisions before it's tied up in probate," he said. "If we wait, half of it will get eaten in taxes." Heather's reply was smoother, more cautious. "Let's just meet with the attorney. Quietly. There's no need to rush in front of people." Her words had that varnished tone she used when she wanted to look respectable while doing something unbecoming. Rachel said nothing for a while. Then her voice, hesitant but firm, floated through. "We should at least agree on who gets what. It'll be easier if we present a united front." Who gets what? My heart thudded at that, though I couldn't move a muscle. They were not whispering about treatment plans or recovery times. They were dividing me in a way, my home, my things, my life's work, as neatly as if they were sharing out slices of pie at Sunday supper. The conversations blurred in and out, days and nights bleeding together. Sometimes I'd hear Malcolm's short, sharp sentences about liquidating assets and market value. Other times Heather would ask the nurse about my capacity, almost casually, as though she were asking about the weather. Rachel's tone softened when she spoke to me directly, but her words to the others were different. "Mom wouldn't want a drawn-out process," she'd say. "We should simplify." Once I caught the squeak of a rolling chair and the rustle of papers. The smell of cologne, my eldest's, told me Malcolm was leaning close. A new voice joined them, male, with the measured cadence of someone used to being listened to. "A lawyer. Given her current state, you can petition for a temporary guardianship," he said. "That will allow you to access accounts and make decisions without her consent." Heather's breath hitched just slightly. "And the house? The retreat property?" "That would be included, pending court approval. If you act quickly, you can avoid certain disputes." I wanted to laugh, or maybe scream at the irony. If only they knew. They spoke as if the deeds and accounts were mine to surrender, as if I were still holding them in my hands. They had no idea I had placed all of it. Every dollar, every acre, every wall built with Walter's hands, into a charitable foundation weeks before my collapse. But I couldn't tell them. My tongue was lead, my eyes closed, my body still. I was a witness trapped inside myself, listening to the cool efficiency with which they discussed the dismantling of my life. One afternoon, at least I think it was afternoon, though time meant little, I felt a presence on either side of me. Heather's perfume reached me first, sharp and floral. Rachel was on my left, her voice closer than usual. "Mom," she murmured, "you'd feel better if you got this settled. It's just a formality." Somewhere behind her, the lawyer's voice came again. "If she can hold a pen, that's enough. We can guide her hand." Then I felt it, the soft pressure of fingers slipping something between mine. A pen. My heart pounded. Inside my head I shouted no, but outwardly nothing changed. My hand was limp, useless, as if it belonged to someone else. Heather's tone was calm, almost bored. "Just for peace of mind." They didn't sound cruel. That was the worst part. They sounded like people ticking items off a list, as if what they were doing was sensible, even kind. But to me, lying there unable to move, it was the clearest confirmation yet. In their eyes, I was not their mother anymore. I was a collection of assets to be managed. I heard the pen's cap click, felt the faint scrape of paper against the sheet near my arm. "Just a signature," the lawyer said softly. Then blessedly the nurse came in. "All right, everyone," she said, firm but polite. "Let's give her some rest." Chairs scraped. Papers shuffled away. Footsteps retreated. The pen was gone, but the weight of what had just happened settled in my chest like a stone. I couldn't stop replaying their words, their tones, the way they didn't even lower their voices when speaking about my things. They weren't worried about me, they were worried about losing control over what I had. The hours after that blurred. Machines hummed. I drifted in and out of that dark water where dreams and memories tangled together. I thought of the cedar chest in my bedroom, full of letters Walter had written me when he was overseas. I thought of the rocking chair on the porch, worn smooth by decades of use. None of these things mattered to them except for what they could fetch in a sale. It hurt, not just the body that refused to work, but the heart that still remembered the days when those same children would curl against me in fever, or bring me dandelions in sticky fists. I could still see Malcolm at 10 years old trying to build a birdhouse in the garage, Heather helping me shell peas on the porch, Rachel asleep on my lap during Sunday service. And now here they were, gathered around my bed not to comfort me, but to portion out my life like a butcher marking cuts on a carcass. I told myself then, though it was only in my head, that if I ever woke, I would not apologize for what I had done a month earlier. I would not hand them back what they thought was theirs by right. They had already made their choice. And lying there, still a stone, I made mine. It was only a month before all this, before the hospital lights, before the whispered plans over my bed, that I sat in my lawyer's office with a folder of papers that would change everything. The day had been one of those clear, cool mornings that feel like they've been scrubbed clean. I remember the way the sunlight fell across the polished oak of his desk, and how my tea steamed gently in the cup he'd brought me. "Eleanor," Mr. Daniels said, adjusting his glasses, "are you certain you want to go through with this? Once the transfer is done, there's no taking it back. Your children will, well, they'll be surprised." I smiled faintly. Surprised is a polite word for it. I had thought long and hard before calling him. For years, I'd brushed off the little comments my children made. About selling the lake cottage, about how much the sideboard would bring in an estate auction, about how I didn't need so much money just sitting there. But there came a point where those words started to feel like fingers tugging at my pockets, like eyes measuring my worth in dollars rather than moments. They didn't know, and I never told them just how much I had. Walter and I had been careful all our lives, investing when we could, holding on to land our parents left us, saving when others spent. The figure was substantial. $20 million in property, savings, and investments, enough to set them up for life if I'd wanted to. But over the years, I'd come to believe it would be more curse than blessing in their hands. I'd watched them grow into capable adults, yes, but also into people who let money loom too large in their thoughts. And I knew in my bones that if I left them this fortune, it would feed the wrong parts of them. It would widen the spaces already growing between us. So I'd spent quiet months thinking about what would matter most when I was gone. I thought about the families I'd met volunteering at the community kitchen, about the young mothers who needed childcare to keep their jobs, about the scholarship funds that had once given me my own first start. The answer came gently, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. A charitable foundation. Not in my name, I didn't need my name carved on a building, but in a way that would keep helping long after I was gone. Mr. Daniels slid the final papers toward me. This document transfers ownership of all listed assets, the properties, bank accounts, investment portfolios, into the Eleanor Trust Foundation. You'll remain the primary director as long as you live, and after that, the board will carry out the mission you've outlined. The mission? I'd written it myself in careful looping script, to provide support, opportunity, and dignity to those in need, without condition or prejudice. I took the pen in my hand and paused. "You're sure this is airtight? They won't be able to undo it?" He nodded. "It's rock solid. And Eleanor, if you're doing this, make peace with the fact they may never understand why." I signed. The pen scratched across the page, steady as my heartbeat. When I set it down, I felt lighter than I had in years. It wasn't spite that moved me. It was clarity. In the days that followed, I went about life as usual, not breathing a word of it to the children. I tended my roses. I baked a pie for Mrs. Lowell next door. I even had the girls from church over for tea, listening to them talk about their grandchildren and summer plans. All the while, the knowledge of what I'd done sat quietly in my chest like a small, steady flame. I didn't do it to punish my children. I did it because love, at least the kind I want to leave behind, is not measured in dollar signs. And I knew that if the worst happened, this decision would be tested. They would not see it as an act of care, but as a theft from them. What I couldn't have guessed, of course, was just how soon that test would come. A month later, my knees buckled in the kitchen and the linoleum rushed up to meet me. And then the lights, the machines, the voices, and those careful, calculated plans I overheard. As I lay in that hospital bed, hearing the lawyer they'd brought in speak of guardianship and accessing accounts, I almost wanted to laugh. They were playing a game for stakes they thought were on the table. But the cards were already gone. They didn't know about the morning sun on Mr. Daniel's desk. They didn't know about the mission statement folded neatly in my top drawer. They didn't know that their mother, the woman they thought of now only as a ledger to be settled, had already closed the book. One day they would. And when that day came, I would stand if I could and tell them exactly why. Time passed differently in the coma. Sometimes it felt like I was drifting in warm water, unanchored, without need or urgency. Other times there was a weight pressing on me, a heaviness that made my thoughts sluggish. I couldn't open my eyes, couldn't lift my head, but I could hear. The voices came and went like waves, nurses murmuring in soft tones, the faint laughter of orderlies passing in the hall, the mechanical beeps that counted my heartbeats one by one. And then there were their voices. Heather's came first one afternoon, crisp and deliberate, as if she were reading from a prepared script. "It's just a matter of signing a few documents," she said to someone nearby. "It will make things easier. We can't have all that property and money sitting in limbo." I recognized the second voice instantly, the lawyer they'd brought in before, the man with the practiced tone. "If she can hold a pen and make a mark, that's sufficient for our purposes. Even if she doesn't understand every detail right now." Didn't understand? I wanted to shout that I understood perfectly, that I knew exactly what they were doing. But my lips didn't move. The third voice, softer but no less determined, was Rachel's. "We just want to make sure things are in order." She'd want that. Her words had the shape of care, but there was a hollowness under them, like a house with all the furniture removed. I felt a shift in the air beside me. A chair scraped against the floor. Someone's perfume, Heather's, drifted over me, sharp and floral. Then something cool and smooth was pressed between my fingers. A pen. Inside my head, alarms rang. No. But outside, my hand lay still, slack as a doll's. My fingers curled only because someone guided them. "Just a little mark here, Mom," Heather coaxed. "For peace of mind." Peace of mind whose, I wondered? Certainly not mine. The lawyer's voice was closer now, almost at my ear. "Right there, yes. We'll steady your hand." I tried, Lord, how I tried to pull away. I screamed in silence inside my own mind. But my body refused me, stubborn in its stillness. A shadow of movement crossed the room, and another voice broke in, the nurse's, firm and protective. "I'm going to have to ask you all to step back. She needs rest." "She's not even awake," Malcolm said, his voice carrying that edge he used when he thought rules didn't apply to him. "All the more reason," the nurse replied. "You can come back later." There was a pause, the kind that comes when people are weighing whether to argue. Then I heard the shuffle of retreating footsteps, the creak of the door. The pen slipped from my fingers. The nurse's hands were gentle but certain as she adjusted my blanket. I felt her lean closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Don't you worry, Mrs. Lane. Nobody's making you sign a thing on my watch." If I could have smiled, I would have. The rest of that day passed in a haze, but the attempt had left something sharp lodged in me. It wasn't just about the papers, it was about the cold precision of it all. They had gathered around my bed not in grief or worry, but in quiet determination to undo what I had done. To them, I was not recovering or fighting, I was in the way. From then on, I listened more carefully, even when their voices came in fragments. I heard Malcolm asking about liquidating the lake property, Heather wondering aloud how soon the court could approve a guardianship, Rachel talking about selling the antiques while the market's still strong. They spoke as if I were an empty chair, as if the space I filled was already vacant. But they didn't know I was there, hearing every word, storing it up like kindling for the day I could finally speak. They didn't know about the $20 million already secured in the foundation, out of their reach. They didn't know that their mother, the one they thought was powerless, had already made her choice long before the coma. And they certainly didn't know that I was waiting, patiently, silently, for the moment I could tell them so myself. The first thing I remember clearly was the smell of coffee. Not fresh brewed from my own kitchen, but the thin, burnt sort they keep in hospital carafes. It drifted in with the sound of a cart squeaking past my door. My eyelids felt like they'd been stitched together, but I willed them open. Light poured in, too bright at first, and the room took shape slowly. Pale walls, the soft green of the privacy curtain, a vase of carnations on the table that I knew hadn't come from my children. They never brought flowers unless someone reminded them. I lay still, trying to take stock. My mouth was dry, my limbs heavy, but the fog in my head had thinned. And then it came to me, the voices, the papers, the pen in my hand. I felt a pang deep in my chest, but it wasn't fear this time. It was understanding. They hadn't been here for me. Not really. Oh, they'd come to the hospital, yes. But their questions hadn't been about whether I was in pain or if I'd woken. They'd been about assets, deeds, accounts. That was what mattered to them. Not the mother in the bed, but the estate under her name. A shadow moved in the doorway, and the nurse stepped in. The same one who'd sent them away when they'd tried to make me sign. She was a sturdy woman with kind eyes, her dark hair pulled into a bun. When she saw my eyes open, her face broke into a warm smile. "Well, would you look at that?" she said, coming closer. "Welcome back, Mrs. Lane. You gave us quite a scare." My voice was rusty, but I managed. "How long?" "Couple of weeks since you came in. You were touch and go for a bit." She poured me a cup of water, held the straw to my lips. The coolness was a blessing. I swallowed, then asked the question that had been burning in me. "My children, have they been here?" She hesitated just a second, not long enough for most to notice, but I did. "They've been by," she said finally. "Mostly to meet with the doctor. And some other visitors." I fixed my gaze on her. "Other visitors?" She glanced toward the door, then back to me, her voice lowering. "A man in a suit. Some talk about papers. Look, it's not really my place, but I've worked here a long time. I've seen families who come to hold a hand, and I've seen families who come to make arrangements. Yours seemed focused on arrangements." I closed my eyes briefly, more to steady myself than to rest. "Guardianship?" I asked. She gave a little nod. "That's the word I heard." There it was, confirmation of what I'd already suspected. They weren't waiting for me to get better. They were working to take control before I could. I felt something stir in me then, a flicker of resolve. My body was weak, but my mind was mine. And it was clear now that if I didn't stand up for myself, no one else would. In the days that followed, I focused on healing slowly, stubbornly. I sat up in bed, even when it made my head spin. I forced my hands to grip the cup without trembling. I asked for the papers from my chart, made the nurses read me the updates. Every regained movement, every clear thought was a small victory. The children came by in turns, never together. Malcolm brought a new briefcase and a quick smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're looking better, Mom," he said, but within 5 minutes he was talking about what the doctors think and next steps for the house. Heather wore sympathy like a well-pressed blouse. She smoothed my blanket and told me I should let them handle things, because stress wouldn't be good for me. Rachel was quieter, almost guilty, but still managed to slip in a question about where the foundation money was being kept. I didn't answer. I simply sipped my water and let them think I was too tired. But I was listening and remembering. It became clear to me that my recovery wasn't just about getting home. It was about getting to that courtroom before they managed to convince a judge I was unfit. By the time the doctor came in to discuss discharge, I was sitting up without help, my hair combed, my mind sharp. "We'll set you up with some physical therapy," he said. "You've got a fight ahead of you if you want full strength back." I smiled faintly. "Oh, doctor, you have no idea." Because this wasn't just about strength in my legs or my lungs. This was about the strength to look my children in the eye and tell them that the $20 million they thought they'd inherit was already gone to a cause worth more than their greed. And I intended to do it standing, not lying in a hospital bed. The day I left the hospital, the air felt sharper, cleaner, like it had been waiting for me. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment before getting into the car, just breathing. My legs trembled under me, but it was my spirit that felt steady for the first time in weeks. Mr. Daniels was the first person I called when I got home. He answered on the second ring, his voice brisk but warm. "Eleanor, I heard you'd been ill." "I'm better now," I said, and I meant it. "But I think it's time for us to meet. There's trouble brewing." An hour later, I was in his office again. The same place where I'd signed away my $20 million estate into the Eleanor Trust Foundation. He leaned back in his chair as I told him everything. The whispers, the lawyer at my bedside, the guardianship talk. "They're going to challenge the transfer," I said. "They'll try to say I wasn't in my right mind when I made it." He nodded slowly. "It's a common tactic in cases like this. But we have the advantage you were in good health when you signed. We have medical records, dated correspondence, notarized documents. They'll have to prove incapacity, and that's not easy." "I want copies of everything," I said. "Every deed, every account statement, every piece of paper that shows I made that decision knowingly." "You'll have them," he promised. "But, Eleanor, there's something else. This won't be just about documents. It's going to get personal. They'll try to paint you as confused, forgetful, easily influenced." I met his gaze. "Then we'll show them they're wrong." The next days became a quiet campaign. While my body healed, my mind sharpened. Each morning I reviewed the files Mr. Daniels sent over, marking dates and signatures in red ink. In the afternoons, I walked the garden paths behind my house, building my strength step by step. The roses had started to fade for the season, but their scent was still rich in the air. I practiced speaking out loud, not to anyone, just to the empty kitchen, telling the story of why I'd made the decision. I told it simply, without venom but with truth, that I loved my children, but they had come to see me as a resource, not as a mother. That I wanted my life's work to help those who truly needed it, not to fuel more greed. Sometimes at night doubt crept in. I'd see Malcolm's boyish grin from years ago, or Heather reading to me from her school books, or Rachel helping me shell peas on the porch. Those memories softened me, and I wondered if I'd been too harsh. But then I'd remember the pen being pressed into my limp hand, the lawyer murmuring in my ear while I lay powerless, and the softness would harden again into resolve. One afternoon, the nurse from the hospital, her name was Claire, stopped by with a tin of oatmeal cookies. "Thought you could use these," she said. We sat at the kitchen table, and she told me more about those days in the hospital. "They came in with papers 3 different times," she said quietly. If I hadn't been on shift that first time, I don't know what might have happened. I squeezed her hand. You did more for me than you know. She smiled. Just promise me you'll stand your ground. I promise, I said. The competency hearing was set for 2 weeks later. It was to determine if I had been of sound mind when I transferred the estate to the foundation. If I lost, everything could be undone, the properties, the accounts, even the foundation itself. Mr. Daniels prepared me for the kinds of questions I'd face. They'll ask about your health, about medications, about whether you were ever confused or forgetful, he said. They'll try to catch you off guard. I've been underestimated before, I told him. It never ends well for the other party. The night before the hearing, I laid out my clothes. A simple navy dress, pearl earrings, my hair combed smooth. I wanted to look exactly as I felt. Steady, clear, unshaken. I took one last walk through the house, touching the familiar things, Walter's armchair, the china cabinet, the cedar chest in my bedroom. Not as possessions, but as pieces of the life I'd lived. If the court ruled against me, all of it could be sold, scattered, stripped of meaning. But if they ruled in my favor, the Eleanor Trust Foundation would continue untouched long after I was gone. That thought steadied me. I slept well that night, which surprised me. Maybe it was because I knew deep down that I had already made the right choice, and now all that remained was to defend it. The morning of the hearing, as Mr. Daniels drove us to the courthouse, I looked out at the passing streets and thought of my children. I wished things had been different. I wished they had been able to see me as more than a means to an end. But wishing wouldn't change the truth. I was ready. Tomorrow they would hear my voice. And this time they wouldn't be able to ignore it. The courthouse was colder than I expected. Not in temperature, though the air conditioning was sharp enough to raise goosebumps, but in feeling. Everything about it seemed designed to keep people small. The echo of footsteps on the marble, the stiff-backed benches, the quiet authority of the bailiff's voice. Mr. Daniels and I sat at the table to the right, my hands folded in my lap. Across from us, my children were gathered with their lawyers. Malcolm looked tense, his jaw set hard enough to crack. Heather wore a silk scarf the color of fresh cream, as if she were attending a luncheon rather than a hearing. Rachel wouldn't meet my eyes. The judge entered, a tall man with hair gone silver at the temples. This hearing, he began, is to determine whether Mrs. Eleanor Lane was of sound mind when she transferred her estate into the Eleanor Trust Foundation. My children's lead lawyer, a smooth-talking man named Grant, rose first. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Mrs. Lane was suffering from significant health issues in the weeks prior to this transfer. Fatigue, shortness of breath, episodes of confusion. These conditions, we believe, compromised her ability to make rational decisions about her finances. He spoke as if I were a fragile relic, something to be handled with care lest it crumble. Furthermore, he continued, we will present testimony from family members and medical professionals indicating that Mrs. Lane was showing signs of cognitive decline before her hospitalization. Cognitive decline. The words hung in the air like a shadow. Grant called Malcolm to the stand first. My eldest son walked up with the air of someone entering a business meeting. Under oath, he described how I had seemed forgetful in recent months, repeating myself during conversations, leaving the kettle on the stove. I wanted to stand and tell the court that yes, I had forgotten a kettle once, because Rachel had called in tears over a friend's troubles, and I'd been listening, not because my mind was failing. But my turn would come. Next was Heather. She spoke gently like she was talking about a sick child. Mom has always been independent, she said. But lately she's been overwhelmed. We thought she might be vulnerable to outside influence. I almost laughed aloud at that. The only outside influence in my decision was my own conscience. Rachel came last, and her testimony was the softest blow, but it still landed. I just don't think she understood the consequences of what she was doing. she said. I think she believed she was protecting us, but she wasn't herself. The judge listened without expression, jotting down notes. Then came their medical witness, a doctor who had seen me twice in the past year for routine checkups. He spoke about my pre-existing cardiovascular issues and possible impacts on mental clarity. Possible, not certain. But their lawyer clung to that word as though it were gospel. By the time they finished, the picture they had painted was of a frail, confused old woman swept into a major financial decision without understanding its weight. I sat very still, my heart steady, because I knew their version of me was as much a fabrication as if they'd written it in a novel. They were counting on the court seeing only that picture, not the woman who had spent months carefully planning a charitable foundation, who had read every document twice before signing. Mr. Daniels leaned toward me. Let them finish, he whispered. When it's your turn, we'll undo it. The last of their witnesses stepped down. Grant gathered his papers with the air of a man who believed the work was already done. Your Honor, he said, we simply ask that the court restore Mrs. Lane's estate to her family where it belongs. Belongs. The word caught in my mind like a burr. The judge looked at Mr. Daniels. Defense. He stood, his voice calm. Your Honor, we will show that Mrs. Lane was fully aware of her actions and entirely competent at the time of the transfer. We will present not only the notarized documents and witness statements from that day, but also Mrs. Lane's own testimony. The judge nodded. Proceed. Mr. Daniels glanced at me. Are you ready? I rose slowly, not because I was weak, but because I wanted each step to carry weight. My children's eyes followed me, Malcolm's tense, Heather's unreadable, Rachel's uncertain. I took my seat at the witness stand, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. For weeks I had waited for this moment. I could feel every word gathering in me, like a tide that had been held back too long. It was my turn now, and I intended to make every sentence count. The courtroom felt even quieter once I was settled in the witness chair. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock above the door and the shuffling of papers from the clerk's desk. My hands rested loosely in my lap, but my heart was steady. Mr. Daniels approached first. Mrs. Lane, he began, let's start at the beginning. Can you tell the court in your own words what decision you made regarding your estate? I looked at the judge, not at my children. Yes, Your Honor. In September of this year, I transferred my entire estate, worth approximately $20 million in property, savings, and investments, into the Eleanor Trust Foundation. I did this deliberately with full knowledge of what it meant, and I did it because I believed it was the best use of my life's work. There was a rustle from the table where my children sat. Malcolm's jaw tightened. Heather's eyes flickered down to her hands. Rachel blinked rapidly. Mr. Daniels nodded. Why did you choose to move such a substantial sum into a charitable foundation, instead of leaving it to your children? I took a slow breath. Because, over the years, I came to see that my children no longer saw me as a person. They saw me as a resource. Our visits grew shorter, our conversations more transactional. We didn't talk about books we'd read or places we'd been. We talked about property values, tax shelters, and who would get the lake house. I let that sit for a moment before continuing. It wasn't anger that guided me, it was clarity. I realized that leaving them this money wouldn't bring us closer. It would only fuel the very thing that had pulled us apart. I wanted what I'd built with Walter over a lifetime to do something more than just make my children comfortable. I wanted it to help people who truly needed it. Mr. Daniels asked, "Can you explain what the Eleanor Trust Foundation does?" I smiled faintly. Its mission is to provide support, opportunity, and dignity to those in need without condition. That means funding scholarships for underprivileged students, supporting shelters, providing childcare for working mothers. It's the kind of work Walter and I always believed in but couldn't do on such a scale while we were raising our family. I glanced briefly toward my children then, not in spite but in sadness. I didn't tell them because I knew they would try to stop me. I was right. Even while I was in the hospital, unable to move, they brought a lawyer to my bedside and tried to make me sign papers to undo my decision. Grant, their lawyer, rose quickly. Objection, Your Honor. Speculation about their motives. The judge looked at me. Mrs. Lane, limit yourself to what you directly experienced. I nodded. I directly experienced a pen being placed in my hand while I was still in a coma, unable to speak. I heard voices around me urging me to just make a mark for peace of mind. That is not speculation. The judge's brows lifted slightly, but he said nothing. Mr. Daniels continued. Mrs. Lane, how was your health at the time you signed the transfer documents? I was in good health for my age, I said firmly. I had regular checkups and I was managing my heart condition with medication. I read every page of those documents myself. I discussed them with Mr. Daniels here, asked questions and signed them in front of a notary. There was no confusion, no hesitation. I knew exactly what I was doing. Grant stepped forward for the cross-examination. His tone was smooth, almost friendly. Mrs. Lane, you mentioned a heart condition. Isn't it true you've been feeling weak and short of breath in the weeks before the transfer? Yes, I said. But feeling tired is not the same as being incapable of making a decision. He tilted his head. You also said you didn't tell your children about the transfer. Doesn't secrecy suggest you knew it would be controversial? It suggests, I replied, that I knew they would try to stop me. And I was right. His smile thinned. And you expect this court to believe you gave away $20 million simply because you didn't want your children to have it? I met his gaze steadily. I didn't give it away to deny them. I gave it away to serve others. That's the difference between seeing me as a resource and seeing me as a person. They never asked what I wanted to do with my life's work. They only asked what they would get from it. So I answered them in my own way. Grant opened his mouth to press further, but the judge raised a hand. I think I've heard enough for now. As I stepped down from the stand, I felt lighter. Not because I thought I'd won, but because I had finally said it aloud, plainly, in front of them all. They knew the truth now. Whether they liked it or not, they could never again say they didn't understand why I did what I did. The courtroom was hushed when I returned to my seat beside Mr. Daniels. My testimony still lingered in the air like the last toll of a bell. The judge shuffled through his notes, his face unreadable. He cleared his throat. I have heard the arguments from both sides, reviewed the evidence, and considered the testimonies presented. His gaze moved briefly to my children, then to me. This case rests on a single question. Was Mrs. Eleanor Lane competent and of sound mind when she transferred her estate into the Eleanor Trust Foundation? I held my breath. The judge continued. The documentation shows the transfer was completed in accordance with all legal requirements, including notarization and independent legal counsel. Medical records from the time do not indicate any cognitive impairment. Mrs. Lane's testimony delivered here today was clear, consistent, and convincing. Heather's hand twitched toward her scarf. Malcolm stared straight ahead, his jaw tightening with every word. Rachel kept her eyes fixed on the table, not looking up. It is the judgment of this court, the judge said, that Mrs. Lane was competent at the time of the transfer. The court affirms that the transfer to the Eleanor Trust Foundation is valid and will stand. There was a sharp intake of breath from Malcolm, followed by a low mutter I couldn't catch. Heather's lips pressed into a thin line, her composure cracking just enough for me to see the fury beneath. Rachel's shoulders slumped, a quiet acceptance or perhaps defeat. The judge wasn't finished. Accordingly, the petition to have Mrs. Lane declared incompetent is denied. The court sees no reason to alter her control over her personal affairs. Mr. Daniels gave a small nod, satisfied. I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The gavel struck once, firm and final. This hearing is adjourned. The murmurs began almost immediately. My children rose together, speaking in low, urgent tones to their lawyers. They didn't look at me as they gathered their coats and briefcases. That hurt more than I'd expected, but it also told me everything I needed to know. I stood steady on my feet and turned toward the aisle. People moved aside without me having to ask. The bailiff gave me a polite nod as I passed. Outside, the autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of dry leaves and distant wood smoke. For the first time in months, the weight on my chest felt lighter, not because I had won, but because I had defended my choice and been heard. Mr. Daniels joined me on the courthouse steps. "You did well in there, Eleanor." "I told the truth," I said simply. "That's all I had to do." He smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's the hardest thing." As we parted ways, I saw my children standing a little distance away. For a heartbeat, I thought they might approach, say something, anything. But they turned, walked to their cars, and drove off without a backward glance. I watched them go, my heart heavy but not broken. Some ties, once stretched too far, don't snap suddenly. They fray strand by strand, until one day you realize there's nothing left to hold. But there was still life ahead for me, and I had work to do. I turned toward home, the courthouse behind me, the Eleanor Trust Foundation ahead. The fight was over, and I had my answer, in law and in conscience. The house was just as I'd left it, though somehow it felt different, lighter, freer. Perhaps it was me who had changed. The moment I stepped through the front door, I let my hand rest on the wall, taking in the familiar scent of lemon polish and faint lavender from the sachets I kept in the hall closet. The silence was gentle now, not the heavy kind that had lingered before my illness. I walked through each room slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the edge of the dining table where my children once sat as teenagers, the windowsill where Walter and I had placed our first potted geranium. I had won the legal battle, yes, but more than that, I had reclaimed my life. The next morning, I went to the foundation's office, a modest brick building downtown. It wasn't large or fancy, but it was full of purpose. The walls were lined with photographs from the programs we'd already funded. Smiling children in new school uniforms, families gathered at shelter dinners, young mothers in classrooms learning new skills. The staff greeted me with warmth that felt real, not the careful politeness I'd seen in the courthouse. "We're glad you're back, Mrs. Lane," said Angela, the program director. "We've got new grant applications for you to look at. There's a rural library in need of repairs, and a clinic expansion project that could really use our help." I spent the morning reviewing proposals, making notes, asking questions. The work was engaging, meaningful. Every dollar had a purpose beyond personal comfort. It was building something that would last longer than any of us. That afternoon, I sat on the back porch with a cup of tea, the sun warming my lap, the garden stretching out before me. I could hear laughter from the neighbor's yard, the high, pure sound of children at play. It brought back a pang of memory, my own children's voices once ringing through this same yard. I wondered if they would ever understand why I'd done what I had. Perhaps not. And perhaps that was no longer my burden to carry. I had given them my time, my care, my love for decades. This choice, to leave my estate to the foundation, was not about taking from them. It was about giving to the world in a way they could not see. Visitors came often now, but they were different kinds of visitors. Claire, the nurse who had defended me in the hospital, stopped by with her little grandson, who insisted on showing me the paper boat he'd folded. Angela brought updates from the foundation's latest scholarship recipients. Neighbors dropped in with jam or pie, and stayed for a chat on the porch. There were no pointed questions about the will or the lake house. No sideways glances at the silver in the dining room. Just conversation, laughter, and the kind of human connection I had missed for too long. One evening, as the sky turned gold and pink, I sat with my tea and thought about Walter. I imagined him sitting in his old armchair, smiling that quiet smile of his. "You did right, Ellie," I could almost hear him say. "You made sure what we built will keep helping, long after we're gone." I smiled back at the thought. The fight, the courtroom, the bitter looks from my children, all of it seemed far away now. What mattered was the peace in my heart, the certainty that I had done what was right. As the sun slipped below the horizon, the garden lights came on, casting a soft glow over the roses. I leaned back in my chair, the cup warm between my hands, and listened to the sound of crickets beginning their night song. I was free. Free from the weight of being seen only as a sum of money. Free to spend the rest of my days in work that mattered, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could give them. It was at last a happier chapter, and I intended to live every page of it.